Welcome to Sleepy Crime. Before we begin tonight's case, I'd love to know where are you watching from right now. It's always fascinating to see how these quiet late-night stories reach people all over the world. And if you enjoy these calm, atmospheric dives into true crime, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, take a deep breath. Settle in. Whether you're lying in bed, wrapped in a blanket, or sitting in a dimly lit room with your headphones on, let the outside world fade away. Let the sound of the rain calm your mind, let your shoulders relax, and let your thoughts slow down. Some mysteries never fade with time. Decades pass, evidence grows cold, and yet the questions remain, haunting the families and investigators who were left searching for answers. Tonight, we're going back to the early 1970s, to a small, quiet city in upstate New York called Rochester, a place where life moved at an easy pace, where parents felt safe letting their children walk home from school, and where neighborhoods seemed untouched by the kind of horrors found in big city headlines. But in 1971, that peace was shattered. A little girl disappeared, and when her body was found, the tragedy shook the community to its core. Soon after, another young girl vanished. Then another. 3 children, all under the age of 12. And that was when investigators noticed something strange, something that would give this case its haunting name. Each girl's first and last name began with the same letter. And the place where their bodies were found. That letter matched, too. The coincidence was chilling, too exact to ignore. A killer was hunting children in Rochester, choosing his victims based on an alphabetical pattern. And no one knew who he was, why he was doing it, or when he would strike again. This became one of America's most infamous unsolved mysteries, a case that would torment investigators for decades, baffle the FBI, and leave families forever broken. And tonight, we'll step back into the streets of Rochester as they were in the early 1970s. Let's begin. In the early 1970s, Rochester, New York, wasn't the kind of place where parents worried about letting their children walk home alone. It was a small city where neighborhoods felt close-knit, where the sound of kids laughing in the streets was part of daily life, and where crime, especially violent crime, felt far away. Families knew each other, shopkeepers greeted customers by name, and evenings were spent on porches while the sun dipped behind the old brick buildings. But on November 16, 1971, that sense of safety shattered, and Rochester would never be the same. That afternoon, 10-year-old Carmen Cullen was last seen leaving a local pharmacy on West Main Street. It was only a short walk back to her grandmother's house, a path she had taken countless times before. Witnesses later recalled seeing her crossing the parking lot, clutching a small bag with her prescription medicine inside. But Carmen never made it home. When she didn't return within the hour, her grandmother began to worry, walking the neighborhood streets and calling her name. Neighbors joined the search, thinking perhaps she had wandered off to play with friends. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the growing panic was undeniable. By nightfall, the Rochester Police Department became involved. Officers retraced Carmen's last known steps, questioning store employees and residents in the area. A few witnesses reported seeing a beige car idling near the pharmacy around the time Carmen left. One even thought they saw her struggling inside the vehicle, though they couldn't describe the driver clearly. At the time the report was filed but gained little traction. No one imagined the danger Rochester was about to face. 2 days later, on November 18, 1971, a pair of teenagers riding bicycles along Interstate 490 made a grim discovery. Roughly 12 miles from where Carmen was last seen, her body lay discarded in a ditch along the highway, partially clothed and bruised. The scene was quiet except for the distant hum of passing cars, and investigators quickly sealed off the area, combing the roadside for clues. The autopsy revealed Carmen had been sexually assaulted and strangled. But there was something unusual about the case that puzzled investigators. Carmen's name, Carmen Colon, began with the same letter as the town where her body was found, Churchville. At first, this detail was dismissed as coincidence, a tragic alignment of circumstances that meant nothing. But in time, this small, seemingly irrelevant detail would haunt the investigation. In the days following Carmen's death, Rochester reeled. Her funeral drew hundreds of mourners, filling the small Catholic church with quiet sobs and unanswered questions. Parents began walking their children to school, doors were locked at night, and fear rippled through the community. For the first time in decades, people in Rochester began to feel that something dark and dangerous had taken root among them. Police were under immense pressure to find answers. They interviewed Carmen's family, friends, teachers, and anyone who might have seen her that afternoon. Her stepfather, who had a complicated relationship with Carmen's mother, was questioned multiple times, but ultimately ruled out as a suspect. The man driving the beige car became a primary focus, but despite widespread pleas for information, no one came forward with a name or license plate number. Weeks passed, then months. Leads dried up. Without witnesses, forensic technology, or a confession, the case stalled. The Rochester Police Department kept Carmen's file open but moved on to other priorities, believing or perhaps hoping this had been an isolated tragedy. But Carmen's death was only the beginning. On April 2, 1973, a little over a year later, 11-year-old Wanda Walkovich failed to return home after running an errand for her mother. Like Carmen, Wanda lived in a working-class neighborhood where children were trusted to navigate the streets alone. She had walked to a nearby corner store to buy groceries, carrying only $1 and a handwritten list. When she didn't come home, her mother searched frantically, eventually calling police. The similarities between Carmen's and Wanda's disappearances were eerie. Both girls were young, both were last seen near small neighborhood stores, and both vanished in the middle of the afternoon, broad daylight, in plain sight. The next morning, Wanda's body was discovered in a ravine near Webster, roughly 15 miles from her home. Like Carmen, she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. And again, the first letter of her name matched the first letter of the location where she was found. Now investigators began to wonder if they were dealing with a predator who was deliberately selecting victims according to a pattern, someone who wasn't killing at random, but hunting carefully, methodically. The case took on a new name, the Alphabet Murders. By the time Wanda's funeral took place, Rochester was already gripped by fear. Children were kept indoors, parents formed walking groups, and schools implemented new safety policies. Investigators began working with the FBI to develop a profile of the killer, suspecting they were dealing with someone who knew the area well, someone who felt comfortable navigating quiet neighborhoods and secluded dumping grounds without drawing attention. And then, just 7 months later, another child disappeared. On November 26, 1973, 11-year-old Michelle Manzo was reported missing after failing to return home from school. Michelle was described as bright, shy, and sweet, the kind of child who would never stray far from her normal route. Witnesses later said they saw Michelle climbing into a car driven by a man they didn't recognize. But the description was vague, a stocky, middle-aged man in a light-colored sedan. 2 days later, Michelle's body was discovered in Macedon, 15 miles from where she vanished. Once again, the first letter of her name matched the location. 3 girls, 3 killings, 3 patterns that could no longer be dismissed. With Michelle's death, the city's quiet fear turned to full-blown panic. Police flooded the streets, checkpoints were set up, and the FBI worked side by side with Rochester detectives. But despite the increased resources, The killer seemed to vanish as suddenly as he appeared. For investigators, the realization was chilling. Someone was outsmarting them. Someone who was methodical, calculating, and deeply familiar with Rochester's neighborhoods and rural outskirts. Someone who might have been living among them all along. The Alphabet murders weren't just shocking because of their brutality. They were terrifying because of the silence that followed each killing. The predator left behind no fingerprints, no useful fibers, no DNA evidence, and no consistent witness descriptions. In an era before modern forensic science, the case became a web of dead ends, missed opportunities, and growing frustration. And then, just as abruptly as the killings began, they stopped. But the mystery had only just begun. In the months following the discovery of Michelle Mines' body in late 1973, Rochester was a city living under constant tension. 3 young girls, Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkovich, and Michelle, were dead. Each victim was close in age, abducted in daylight, and found in locations that eerily mirrored the initials of their names. The realization struck investigators with quiet dread. They were not looking at isolated tragedies. They were dealing with a predator, one who was methodical, deliberate, and frighteningly precise. The murders had stopped for the moment, but fear had not. Parents escorted their children to school. After-dark activities were canceled. Police cars patrolled neighborhoods that had once felt safe, and the local news stations led with the same grim headline every night: "The Alphabet Killer Still at Large." Behind the scenes, investigators from the Rochester Police Department and the FBI assembled one of the largest task forces the city had ever seen, bringing together forensic specialists, behavioral experts, and local detectives in an effort to unravel the killer's strategy before he struck again. The first significant breakthrough came when investigators revisited every known detail from the 3 murders, laying out photographs, maps, and timelines on a massive evidence board. As they studied the data, 2 unsettling truths became clear. First, the killer seemed intimately familiar with Rochester's geography, carefully selecting locations that allowed him to move undetected. Second, the pattern of matching initials was unlikely to be coincidence. Statisticians within the FBI calculated the odds of 3 unrelated murders involving such patterns as astronomically low, suggesting deliberate victim selection rather than random opportunity. This theory reshaped the investigation. Detectives began combing through school records, church rosters, and youth programs, searching for any connection among girls whose first and last names shared initials. The grim implication was unavoidable. The killer might already know his future victims before approaching them. Parents were urged to report any suspicious activity, while the FBI prepared detailed victimological profiles, studies of personality traits, family dynamics, and social patterns designed to predict the killer's preferences. But despite their efforts, the evidence remained frustratingly sparse. Witness accounts were inconsistent, varying descriptions of the suspect's vehicle and appearance leading investigators in circles. Some remembered a beige sedan, others swore it was dark green. Height estimates ranged from average to tall, build descriptions from thin to stocky. Forensic technology of the early 1970s couldn't yet provide DNA matches, and no fingerprints linked the murders together. Pressure mounted on law enforcement as frustration within the community deepened. Rumors spread quickly, fed by fear and speculation. Some whispered about cult activity, suggesting the killings were ritualistic in nature. Others believed the perpetrator was a trusted member of the community, perhaps a teacher, a police officer, or even a priest. Theories flourished, but hard evidence remained elusive. Then came the suspects. The first major lead focused on Miguel Colon, Carmen's uncle. Investigators discovered he had fled to Puerto Rico shortly after her murder, a decision that immediately raised suspicion. He had purchased a car resembling the one seen near the pharmacy on the day Carmen disappeared, and several family disputes were uncovered during interviews. When questioned years later, Miguel vehemently denied involvement, claiming he left Rochester to escape relentless harassment from police and neighbors. Without physical evidence tying him to the crimes, he was never charged, but to this day some investigators believe his name belongs on the short list of possibilities. Attention then shifted to Kenneth Bianchi, a Rochester native whose name would later become infamous as one of the hillside stranglers in Los Angeles. At the time of the Alphabet murders, Bianchi was in his early 20s and living in the area. His documented predatory behavior in later years raised the possibility that his violent tendencies began earlier than previously believed. Detectives revisited his employment history and personal connections during the period of the murders, but while his later crimes bore similarities, no direct evidence tied him to Rochester's missing girls. Forensic experts pushed investigators to focus on behavioral profiling rather than chasing endless suspects. They hypothesized that the killer was likely a white male, aged 25 to 35, someone with a calm, controlled personality capable of blending into the community without suspicion. He probably worked a job that allowed him to move freely during the day and maintained a personal vehicle, possibly one matching the descriptions given by witnesses. The matching initials pattern suggested he was highly organized, perhaps compulsive, and took time selecting his victims carefully, studying them before striking. Despite the mounting pressure, law enforcement found itself at an impasse. Every path forward ended in frustration. No confession. No witnesses with reliable details. No recovered murder weapon. Meanwhile, the community's fear only deepened. Children were forbidden from walking alone, and every unfamiliar car became a reason to call the police. Even within families, suspicion quietly brewed. Parents, neighbors, co-workers, anyone could be hiding something. By 1974, nearly a year after Michelle Mines's death, the Alphabet murders investigation had consumed hundreds of hours, spanned multiple agencies, and yet remained maddeningly unsolved. Without new victims or fresh evidence, momentum began to slow. Detectives worried the killer had either left Rochester or learned to change his methods entirely, leaving them chasing a ghost that no longer existed in the same form. But behind the scenes, the FBI continued monitoring potential connections. Unsolved murders in neighboring counties were quietly compared to the Rochester cases, looking for patterns that might indicate movement across state lines. A few suspicious deaths in nearby towns drew attention, but none matched the chilling alphabetical signature. And so, the case began to cool. For the families of the victims, this was unbearable. They attended every press conference, hoping for updates, clinging to rumors of breakthroughs that never came. For them, there were no statistics or theories. There were only 3 little girls who deserved answers. Year after year, birthdays passed without celebration, and questions remained unspoken because there were no new answers to give. By the mid-1970s, the Rochester Police Department faced an uncomfortable truth. Despite the size of their task force, despite the support of the FBI, despite the endless interviews and leads, they were no closer to finding the Alphabet killer than they had been on the day Carmen disappeared. But the absence of answers didn't mean the story was over. It simply meant the killer had the advantage, and somewhere out there, someone still carried the weight of secrets never told. By early 1975, Rochester had become a city living in the shadow of fear. 3 young girls were gone, Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkovich, and Michelle Mines, and despite hundreds of interviews, thousands of man-hours, and the involvement of the FBI, the killer remained a ghost. Parents no longer let their children walk home alone, and whispers about the Alphabet killer filled classrooms, church pews, and quiet dinner tables. Detectives had built mountains of files and evidence boards covered in photographs, maps, and handwritten notes. But the deeper they dug, the more elusive their suspect seemed. Dozens of potential witnesses were re-interviewed. Tips flooded in daily: strange cars, suspicious neighbors, unfamiliar faces lurking near playgrounds. But none of them brought investigators closer to the truth. The task force began to focus heavily on patterns. Behavioral profilers believed the killer was meticulous, organized, and possibly suffering from obsessive-compulsive tendencies. The alphabetical connection between victims' names and the towns where they were found couldn't be coincidence. This suggested someone who derived satisfaction from creating order within chaos, a killer who carefully selected his victims based on highly personal criteria. Investigators even considered whether the offender had access to school records or church rosters to pre-select potential targets. But while the profile became sharper, the evidence remained stubbornly thin. Forensics in the early 1970s had significant limitations. No DNA testing, no digital tracking, no databases cross-referencing missing persons with violent offenders. Police relied on fingerprints, fibers, and shoe impressions. But the killer left little to nothing behind. He abducted children quickly, killed them within hours, and dumped their bodies in secluded locations, minimizing the chance of traceable clues. The frustration of the task force grew. Dozens of suspects were questioned, and several polygraph tests administered, but none yielded results. Among the most heavily scrutinized were men who lived near the victims' homes, including neighbors, delivery drivers, and even school bus operators. One driver in particular drew attention for inconsistent statements, but after an exhaustive investigation, police couldn't tie him to any of the murders. Meanwhile, public pressure intensified. Rochester residents accused law enforcement of incompetence and negligence, particularly after it was revealed that possible sightings of Carmen's abduction in 1971 hadn't been aggressively followed up at the time. Community meetings turned emotional, with grieving families pleading for more resources and faster action. Fear became resentment, and resentment became anger. By 1976, the lack of progress forced investigators to broaden their search beyond Rochester. They began looking into similar crimes across New York State, hoping the killer might have struck elsewhere. Over 150 unsolved child homicides were compared against the alphabet murders, but no clear connections emerged. Then came the possibility of multiple offenders. Some profilers theorized that the differences between the crime scenes, the level of violence, how the bodies were positioned, and the choice of dumping sites suggested more than one perpetrator. Could there have been two killers working together, a predator and an accomplice? Or was the inconsistency deliberate, meant to mislead investigators? The uncertainty deepened the mystery. Despite the tension, the killing stopped after Michelle Manzea's death in 1973. This presented an agonizing dilemma for law enforcement. Had the killer moved, died, or simply chosen to wait? Without new cases, the trail went cold. The task force was scaled back, and many detectives were reassigned, leaving only a small group of investigators working the file. For the families of the victims, the silence was unbearable. They gathered every year on the anniversaries of their daughters' deaths, holding vigils in their memory and urging authorities not to give up. One mother described waking up each day and reliving the nightmare, hoping for closure that never came. Years passed. Advances in forensic technology brought fresh hope in the 1990s and 2000s as DNA evidence began to revolutionize cold case investigations. In 2007, Rochester police reopened the alphabet murders, submitting decades-old samples from the victims' clothing for advanced testing. Unfortunately, the degradation of the evidence and cross-contamination over the years produced inconclusive results. The killer's identity remained locked in silence. By now, only theories remain. Some investigators are convinced that Miguel Colon, Carmen's uncle, remains the most likely suspect due to his sudden flight after the first murder and his ownership of a car similar to the one seen near the abduction site. Others believe the killer was a stranger, a drifter who left Rochester after the final murder, taking his secrets with him. A smaller group suspects Kenneth Bianchi, the future hillside strangler, but without DNA confirmation. This remains speculation. Half a century later, the Alphabet murders haunt Rochester like a quiet echo. Families still ask questions that have no answers. Retired detectives still revisit their case notes, convinced they overlooked something small, some detail hidden in plain sight. And yet, the truth continues to elude everyone who has searched for it. By 1975, the Rochester Police Department and the FBI had exhausted nearly every traditional investigative tool available to them. 3 young girls, Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkovich, and Michelle Manza, were gone, and yet the case had yielded no viable suspects, no conclusive evidence, and no confession. The killer's precision baffled detectives, and the chilling alphabetical pattern of the murders, victims' names matching the initials of the locations where they were found, made it clear this was not random violence. This was planned. The FBI's behavioral science unit, still in its early years, began constructing one of the first detailed criminal profiles for the Alphabet killer. Led by emerging experts in offender psychology, investigators studied the timing, locations, and behaviors surrounding the abductions. The profile they developed was both fascinating and terrifying. According to their analysis, the killer was likely a white male, aged 25 to 35, someone intelligent, organized, and intimately familiar with Rochester's geography. He probably lived locally and moved comfortably through the neighborhoods where his victims disappeared. The method of abduction, approaching children in daylight, near public places, suggested someone with a disarming presence, possibly someone children trusted instinctively. He might have posed as an authority figure, perhaps claiming to be a relative, a teacher, or even someone connected to law enforcement. The alphabetical connection fascinated profilers. While it could have been coincidence, they believed it more likely reflected the killer's compulsive personality. This was someone who planned meticulously, possibly even scouting multiple potential victims before choosing his targets based on their names. Detectives revisited school rosters and church attendance lists searching for children whose initials matched nearby towns or landmarks, worried that the killer had already marked others. Parallel to the FBI's psychological work, local detectives examined physical evidence again, desperately hoping to uncover something they had missed. Fibers collected from the victim's clothing were analyzed repeatedly, though 1970s technology offered limited answers. Tire impressions from the crime scenes hinted at a sedan-style vehicle, but brands and models were too common to narrow down suspects. A few witnesses described seeing a light-colored Dodge Dart near one of the abductions, but registration records returned hundreds of matches. With little progress, detectives expanded the investigation scope. They compiled a database, primitive by today's standards, of known sex offenders across Monroe County and neighboring areas. Interviews with more than 800 men were conducted over the next 2 years. Many submitted voluntarily to polygraph tests. Dozens were cleared. A few remained under quiet suspicion, but none could be linked definitively to the crimes. Despite the pressure, the case kept collapsing under its own weight. One theory even suggested that the Alphabet murders were the work of 2 offenders acting together. Some profilers pointed to inconsistencies between the murders, the differences in locations, victim disposal methods, and behavioral patterns at the scenes hinted at more than one set of hands. If true, This possibility made the case exponentially more difficult. While profilers refined their theories, Rochester's residents grew restless. Families of the victims, many of whom had lost faith in law enforcement, publicly criticized investigators, demanding more transparency and faster progress. Parents created neighborhood watch groups, volunteers patrolled school zones, and schools began teaching children about stranger danger for the first time in the area as history. Rochester, once a quiet city, became defined by paranoia and mistrust. Then came the media's involvement. Local and national news outlets began referring to the killer as the alphabet murderer or the double initial killer, amplifying public fear and further pressuring police to deliver results. Reporters published speculative theories, some implying occult connections, others suggesting the murders were tied to a hidden network of offenders. Theories flourished faster than facts could be verified, and rumors became indistinguishable from evidence. Still, amid the noise, a few promising leads emerged, most notably the renewed scrutiny of Miguel Colon, Carmen's uncle. Investigators discovered that, days after Carmen's murder, Miguel abruptly left Rochester for Puerto Rico. He had purchased a beige car similar to the one described by witnesses, and his strained relationship with Carmen's family raised additional suspicion. Years later, detectives traveled to Puerto Rico to re-interview him. Miguel denied any involvement and cooperated with questioning, but lacking physical evidence, authorities couldn't build a case. Another potential suspect gained attention decades later, Kenneth Bianchi, one of the infamous hillside stranglers who terrorized Los Angeles in the late 1970s. Bianchi had grown up in Rochester and would have been in his early 20s at the time of the alphabet murders. He fit portions of the FBI's profile: intelligent, manipulative, and capable of gaining victims' trust. Detectives revisited his childhood addresses, employment history, and connections to Rochester schools, but despite strong suspicion, investigators never found conclusive proof tying him to the murders. By the late 1970s, the case began to stall. Without new victims, tips dwindled, and funding for the task force was reduced. For a time, the alphabet murders faded from headlines, but they never faded from the minds of the families or the few detectives who remained committed to solving them. In the 1990s, renewed hope came with the advent of DNA profiling. Samples preserved from the original investigations were retested using cutting-edge techniques. But time had taken its toll: degradation, mishandling, and cross-contamination left the results inconclusive. It was a devastating setback for investigators and families alike, and yet Rochester has never let the alphabet murders go entirely cold. Over the decades, advancements in forensic science have periodically breathed new life into the case, but each time, hope has collided with reality. The killer remains unidentified, his motives unexplained, his presence still haunting a community that has carried unanswered questions for over 50 years. Even now, experts remain divided. Some believe the killer was a local predator who died or relocated after the third murder. Others suspect he was a transient offender, someone who passed briefly through Rochester before moving on to other crimes elsewhere. A smaller but persistent group clings to the belief that the answer lies within Rochester itself, that the killer lived, worked, and blended seamlessly into the same community that feared him. The alphabet murders are frozen in time, bound by the limitations of 1970s technology and fractured by decades of uncertainty. But for many in Rochester, the horror isn't just that the killer got away. It's the possibility that he was never truly gone. By the early 1980s, the alphabet murders had become one of Rochester's darkest legends. Years had passed since the last known killing, yet fear lingered like a shadow over the community. Parents still remembered the warnings, the news bulletins, the faces of the 3 little girls whose lives had been stolen. For families of the victims, there was no moving on. The unanswered questions haunted them, and every few years, when detectives reopened the case files, old wounds bled anew. For investigators, the decades following the murders were marked by quiet frustration. The technology available in the 1970s had left them with little more than theories, circumstantial evidence, and stacks of reports. Yet hope arrived in the 1990s and 2000s when advances in forensic science promised to illuminate what had long remained hidden. Rochester police began revisiting evidence stored for nearly 30 years, clothing fibers, and biological samples carefully preserved in sealed containers. The promise was simple but powerful. DNA analysis had become one of law enforcement's most effective tools. For the first time, investigators could compare tiny fragments of biological material against national databases to search for matches. But as technicians carefully examined samples from the alphabet murders, a devastating reality set in. Decades of storage had degraded critical evidence, and cross-contamination over years of handling made results unreliable. The few partial DNA profiles extracted were insufficient for conclusive identification. Despite the setback, hope refused to die. In 2007, a task force revisited the files yet again, this time combining traditional detective work with new computational tools. Analysts mapped out detailed timelines of each victim's last movements, cross-referencing locations, traffic patterns, and vehicle sightings. Digital models recreated Rochester in the 1970s, showing where each child had vanished and where their bodies were recovered. From the simulations, one fact stood out: the killer had chosen dumping grounds with remarkable precision, selecting spots close to highways yet secluded enough to avoid detection. This revelation renewed an old theory that the killer knew Rochester intimately. He didn't stumble upon his victims by chance. He planned every step, knowing where to intercept them and where to disappear without being seen. Detectives suspected he might have lived or worked near the victims' neighborhoods, giving him plausible reasons to move around unnoticed. Around the same time, investigators revisited the suspect pool. Files on Miguel Colon and Kenneth Bianchi were examined in depth, but both presented obstacles. Colon had died in 1991, making DNA confirmation impossible without exhumation, and Bianchi's cooperation was limited, while his later crimes, as one of the Hillside Stranglers, bore similarities. Rochester detectives lacked the evidence needed to formally tie into the alphabet murders. The passage of time also brought new suspects forward. A handful of registered sex offenders from the 1970s resurfaced as possible leads, including a mechanic who had lived near two of the victims and frequently traveled along the highways where bodies were found. Another was a delivery driver whose route intersected all three abduction sites. Both men voluntarily submitted DNA samples in the early 2000s, but neither matched the limited profiles available. Meanwhile, Rochester's residents lived with the unspoken burden of unsolved trauma. For the families of Carmen, Wanda, and Michelle, every anniversary brought media coverage, reopening wounds that never healed. Year after year, they attended memorials, met with detectives, and pleaded publicly for information. Mothers grew old without answers, fathers carried guilt for letting their daughters walk alone, and siblings spent decades wondering why justice never came. The impact on Rochester went deeper than fear. The alphabet murders reshaped how the city approached child safety. Community watch programs expanded, schools implemented strict dismissal policies, and parents grew hyper-vigilant about unfamiliar vehicles and strangers. Rochester became one of the first cities in the region to adopt coordinated missing child alert systems, changes spurred directly by the lingering memory of three names carved into history. Even as years passed without resolution, the case remained alive inside the minds of detectives. Retired investigators kept copies of files in their homes, unable to let go of unsolved questions. A few spent personal time reviewing old notes, convinced the answer lay buried in overlooked details, a missed statement, a wrongly dismissed suspect, a fragment of evidence mislabeled in storage. In 2011, another wave of forensic testing offered renewed hope. Improved techniques made it possible to analyze degraded DNA samples more accurately. But results again fell short. While the technology had advanced, the preserved evidence had suffered irreversible damage from decades of exposure and handling. The haunting conclusion remained the same. The killer's identity was locked behind time itself. Still, the Alphabet murders occupy a unique place in criminal profiling history. The FBI continues to study the case when training behavioral analysts, using it as an example of offender ritualization, selecting victims based on symbolic traits, in this case initials. Investigators believe the killer derived psychological satisfaction from creating order and pattern, a compulsion that overrode even practical considerations of risk. And yet, just as eerily, his ritual stopped after 3 killings, leaving unanswered questions. Why and suddenly? Did he die, relocate, or simply choose to stop? For Rochester, the silence remains the most unsettling part of the story. Decades later, people still debate what happened. Was the killer hiding among them all along? Was he someone they knew, someone who waved hello in passing, who attended the same church picnics and school events? Or was he a traveler, a shadow who slipped into the city briefly, left 3 broken families behind, and vanished forever? The case today lives in the digital era. Online forums dissect every detail, amateur sleuths track family trees, and podcasts breathe new attention into theories once buried in archives. In 2022, renewed discussions even prompted another round of cold case reviews using genealogical DNA, a technique that has solved dozens of infamous cases in recent years. But so far, no revelations have come. The identity of the Alphabet killer remains just out of reach. For the families who have waited half a lifetime, hope persists quietly but stubbornly. All it takes is one match, one forgotten detail rediscovered, one small piece of evidence that technology has not yet unlocked. Until then, Rochester carries the memory of 3 little girls whose names became synonymous with one of the most haunting unsolved cases in American history. By the time the Alphabet murders entered the 21st century, nearly 3 decades had passed since the last known killing, but the case still haunted Rochester. Families of the victims, now older and quieter but no less determined, held on to hope that technology would finally succeed where human memory had failed. Investigators, too, had evolved, armed with tools that detectives in the 1970s could never have imagined. Digital forensics, genealogical DNA, and advanced criminal profiling promised answers, but the shadows surrounding the case proved far more stubborn than anyone expected. The push to re-examine the Alphabet murders began in earnest in the mid-2000s. A special cold case unit, working alongside the FBI and state forensic laboratories, reopened long-sealed evidence boxes containing fibers, clothing hair samples, and biological traces collected from the 3 crime scenes. This was delicate work. Decades of storage in less than ideal conditions had compromised some materials, but the hope was that modern testing could recover something usable, even the smallest DNA fragment. By 2007, the first round of modern DNA testing began. Investigators used short tandem repeat STR analysis, a method capable of extracting profiles from degraded samples. A few partial DNA sequences were recovered, but they were incomplete and unusable for identification. Undeterred, Rochester police stored every result in the National CODIS database, waiting for a future match. The real breakthrough in forensic science came years later with the introduction of genetic genealogy. a method that combines DNA analysis with public genealogy databases to identify distant relatives of unknown suspects. High-profile cases like the capture of the Golden State Killer in 2018 renewed hope for Rochester's cold case unit. They submitted the preserved DNA again for genealogical testing, knowing that a single match, even a distant cousin, could lead them to the killer's family tree. But once again, the investigation met a wall. Contamination from decades of evidence handling made building a reliable genealogical profile impossible. The heartbreak was immediate and profound, particularly for the families of Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkovich, and Michelle Manza, who had spent decades imagining justice. Each time technology promised breakthroughs, reality reminded them how fragile the surviving evidence had become. As investigators pursued new forensic strategies, attention turned to another promising avenue, data-driven geographic profiling. Analysts reconstructed Rochester in the 1970s using historical maps, traffic studies, and census records, tracing potential paths the killer might have taken during the abductions and body disposals. The resulting models revealed something fascinating. All three victims had vanished within a few miles of each other, yet their bodies were discarded in different rural areas along highways leading away from Rochester. The chosen dump sites were quiet, hidden from sight, but also positioned for fast escapes, a sign the killer was intimately familiar with both urban neighborhoods and remote back roads. This reinforced an old theory. The alphabet killer wasn't an outsider. He likely lived or worked in Rochester, blending into the community while quietly hunting his victims. He understood how to move without drawing attention, how to avoid cameras and witnesses, and how to exploit gaps in police patrol patterns. The killer's apparent knowledge of the school schedules, victim routines, and isolated routes deepened suspicions that he might have had personal access to information about children, possibly through work connected to schools, churches, or youth programs. As technology evolved, so did the public's involvement. In the 2010s, the rise of online communities brought a new wave of attention to the alphabet murders. Forums, podcasts, and independent researchers began poring over old case files, news clippings, and geographic data. Amateur sleuths built timelines, compiled maps, and tracked possible suspects' family histories using genealogical tools available to the public. These digital investigations revived old theories and uncovered forgotten witness statements, forcing authorities to revisit leads dismissed decades earlier. One renewed suspect discussion involved Kenneth Bianchi, the Rochester native later convicted as one of the hillside stranglers in Los Angeles. Internet sleuths compared the behavioral patterns of the hillside stranglings to the alphabet murders, noting similarities in victim selection, control, and disposal techniques. Investigators acknowledged the parallels, but reminded the public of a glaring issue. There was no physical evidence tying Bianchi to the Rochester murders, and much of his timeline from 1971 to 1973 remains inconclusive. Another theory focused again on Miguel Colon, Carmen's uncle, who fled to Puerto Rico after her death. Genealogical testing could theoretically confirm or rule him out, but Miguel died in 1991, and his remains have never been tested. Some believe his sudden departure and car ownership fit too neatly to be coincidence. Others argue he was an easy target for suspicion due to family tensions. Despite the dead ends, the renewed scrutiny inspired a new generation of investigators to push for one last comprehensive forensic effort. In 2021, a partnership between Rochester Police, the FBI, and a private lab specializing in degraded DNA began carefully reprocessing evidence using next-generation sequencing techniques. This technology, capable of reconstructing highly fragmented genetic material, has solved other decades-old cases once thought unsolvable. While results remain sealed, insiders suggest progress has been made. though no public statements confirm a breakthrough. For the families, each passing year brings a painful mixture of hope and exhaustion. They watch cases once colder than theirs finally solved, like the Golden State Killer or the Boy in the Box, proving that persistence can pay off when science catches up. But for Rochester, patience has become its own burden. Decades have blurred witness memories, suspects have died, and evidence has faded. Yet, beneath the surface, the belief remains. Somewhere, one piece of information, one untapped lead, or one technological advance could expose the truth. The Alphabet murders stand as both tragedy and catalyst. They represent deep personal loss, but also shaped Rochester's legacy of safety reforms and inspired modern investigative techniques nationwide. The killings led directly to changes in missing child alert systems, child protection protocols, and multi-agency collaboration methods, tools that have since saved countless lives. Still, the mystery endures. The initials, the patterns, the precision, they continue to haunt investigators who've spent their careers seeking answers. Was the killer a trusted face hiding in plain sight? Was he a stranger passing through, gone before suspicion found him? Or is he someone who lived quietly in Rochester all these years, watching the world search for him while he disappeared into ordinary life? And yet, technology has rewritten the rules of justice. Where once time favored the killer, it now favors investigators. Forensic genealogy continues to evolve. Data-driven predictive models grow sharper every year. And what was once invisible can now be revealed with a single drop of preserved evidence, a forgotten fingerprint, or a match hidden deep within public databases. The shadows of Rochester's Alphabet murders have stretched across 5 decades, but the case is not closed. New science, new persistence, and new eyes keep the search alive. Until the day comes when the initials behind the killer's name are finally known, the story remains open, a cold case that refuses to fade, a secret still waiting to be unlocked. The streets of Rochester in the early 1970s were quiet, lined with modest homes and shaded by tall, whispering trees. It was the kind of place where parents let their children walk to the store, where neighbors waved from porches, and where the sound of bicycle wheels on pavement filled the summer air. No one thought danger could be hiding here. No one imagined that a shadow was already moving silently through their streets, watching, choosing, waiting. The first time it happened was November 1971. Carmen Colon, just 10 years old, was sent on an errand, a simple task she had done before. She walked into a local pharmacy, picked up her medicine, and began the short journey home. But she never arrived. By nightfall, her family was searching the streets, calling her name, knocking on doors. 2 days later, her body was found miles away, near Churchville, discarded along the roadside. For a time, people whispered that it must have been a random tragedy, a single act of violence. But Rochester was about to learn that this was only the beginning. In April 1973, 11-year-old Wanda Walkovich vanished while running an errand for her mother. She was last seen walking home with a small bag of groceries, the spring sun still bright in the sky. The next day, her body was found in Webster, a rural area outside the city. People noticed the strange coincidence almost immediately. Carmen's initials, C. C matched the place she was found, Churchville. Wanda's initials, W. W matched Webster. It was unsettling, but at first, some dismissed it as chance. Then, in November 1973, 11-year-old Michelle Mimza disappeared on her way home from school. Witnesses later remembered seeing her near a car, talking to a man they didn't recognize. 2 days later, her body was discovered near Macedon. 3 girls, 3 matching patterns. Carmen in Churchville, Wanda in Webster, Michelle in Macedon. By now, coincidence was no longer an explanation anyone could believe. People began locking their doors at night. Parents stopped letting their children walk anywhere alone. Newspapers called him the Alphabet Killer, a name that brought with it a quiet terror, a reminder that someone out there was hunting deliberately, methodically, and without leaving a trace. Detectives worked tirelessly, covering walls with maps, photographs, and timelines. They knocked on doors, interviewed families, tracked vehicle sightings, and built psychological profiles. They learned quickly that this was no impulsive attacker. Whoever he was patient. He didn't stumble upon his victims by accident. He chose them. He may have studied them, learning their routines, following them until the moment he acted. Witnesses mentioned a light-colored sedan seen near one of the abduction sites. Others described a man, average height, possibly stocky, someone who didn't look threatening, someone a child might trust enough to approach. Investigators believed he likely posed as an authority figure, maybe pretending to be a teacher or a police officer. But despite these fragments of information, the man behind the wheel remained invisible. Dozens of suspects were questioned, some even subjected to lie detector tests. One of the earliest names was Miguel Colon, Carmen's uncle, who fled Rochester shortly after her death. He owned a car similar to the one witnesses described, and tensions in the family raised eyebrows. Investigators pursued him, even traveling to Puerto Rico years later to question him again, but without physical evidence, they could go no further. Miguel died in 1991, leaving unanswered questions behind. Then there was Kenneth Bianchi, a Rochester native who would later become infamous as one of the hillside stranglers in Los Angeles. At the time of the Alphabet murders, Bianchi was in his early 20s and living in the area. Years later, as his name became tied to other killings, detectives wondered if his violent tendencies had started long before California. But again, no evidence connected him definitively to Carmen, Wanda, or Michelle. As years passed, the case went cold. The children's faces faded from front pages, but their families never forgot, and neither did the investigators who worked those long nights under flickering fluorescent lights. Files sat in boxes, untouched, until technology offered new hope. In the 1990s, advances in DNA analysis gave cold case detectives something they'd been missing for decades. Evidence collected from the crime scene's fibers, clothing, biological traces, was carefully tested. For the first time, there was a chance to match something, anything, to a suspect. But decades had taken their toll. Many samples had degraded, and those that remained were too damaged to yield complete profiles. Still, the fight for answers continued. When genetic genealogy revolutionized cold case investigations in the 2010s, Rochester investigators revisited the Alphabet murders again. This time, they hoped to find distant relatives of the killer through family DNA submitted to public databases. Other cases, once considered unsolvable, had been cracked using this technique, the Golden State Killer being the most famous. Rochester held its breath, but the results were inconclusive. The fragments of DNA they had simply weren't enough. And yet, the story refuses to fade. The Alphabet murders live on in cold case forums, investigative podcasts, and late-night documentaries. Digital communities have reconstructed timelines, tracked vehicle sightings, and analyzed every public record available. Amateur genealogists have traced possible family trees, while others pore over archived news clippings, convinced the killer was hiding in plain sight all along. Even so, nothing definitive has surfaced up, no match. No confession. No closure. For the families, the silence is the hardest part. Parents have passed away without knowing what happened to their daughters. Siblings, now older than the girls ever were, still attend memorials, standing under soft candlelight as names are read aloud. Carmen, Wanda. Michelle, The wind carries whispers through Rochester's quiet streets, and though time has dulled the shock, the ache remains. Some investigators believe the killer is long dead, that the secrets went to the grave with him. Others insist he might still be alive, an elderly man now perhaps living quietly somewhere, carrying memories of what he did all those years ago. And a smaller group believes something even more unsettling, that the killer learned to hide better. That after 3 murders, he changed his methods, moved his hunting grounds, and vanished into a pattern so invisible no one ever noticed again. The case endures because it forces us to confront something deeply human, the limits of understanding, the fragility of justice, and the way time erodes both memory and evidence. Decades of searching have taught us that monsters don't always look like monsters. They can walk beside us unnoticed, blending into the fabric of ordinary life. And so, the alphabet murders remain suspended in time, unresolved, echoing through the years like the soft hum of a forgotten song. Somewhere, the truth exists in an overlooked detail, a piece of evidence too small to see, a name buried in a witness statement from 50 years ago. Maybe one day, technology will bring it into focus. Until then, Rochester waits. It waits for justice. It waits for closure. And it waits for the moment when the initials on a long-forgotten piece of evidence will finally spell out the name of the person who has haunted this city for half a century. The story of the alphabet murders lingers in Rochester like the soft hum of a memory that refuses to fade. Decades have passed since the last body was found, but the unease remains, woven into the quiet streets, the shaded sidewalks, and the small houses where children once played freely without fear. 3 little girls, Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkovich, and Michelle Manza, became the center of one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries, and yet the final chapter remains unwritten. Detectives have retired, case files have yellowed with time, and new technologies have risen to meet old questions. But even with the most advanced tools available today, the killer's name remains unknown. He is an echo, a shadow that passed through Rochester and left behind patterns, initials, and grief, but never a face. Each time investigators revisit the case, new hopes bloom and fade in the same breath. The evidence is too fragile, the memories too faded, the trail too cold. And yet, for those who remember, the weight of the alphabet murders is not just in the unanswered questions, but in what they revealed about vulnerability, trust, and the hidden dangers of ordinary life. People who grew up in Rochester still recall how the city changed, doors locked earlier. Children walked to school in groups, parents watched their neighborhoods with wary eyes. It was a shift from innocence to awareness, a moment when everyone realized that safety could be an illusion, that sometimes danger hides in the quietest corners, wearing the most familiar faces. Over the years, new investigators have looked at the case with fresh perspectives. Some remain convinced that the killer was local, a man who knew the streets, the families, and the routines of the children he targeted. Others believe he was a transient predator, someone passing through Rochester on business or travel, vanishing as quickly as he arrived. A few are haunted by a darker possibility, that he never left, that he stayed, that he blended into the fabric of the city, living out his days just blocks from where his victims once played. But what unsettles investigators most is not just what they know, it is what they don't see. After Michelle's death in 1973, the murders stopped. No more victims, no more patterns, no more initials. Did the killer die? Did he leave Rochester forever? Or did he find new hunting grounds where the same rituals continued unnoticed, unconnected, forgotten by everyone except the families he left shattered in silence? The case remains open even now. A few dedicated detectives still revisit the evidence when time and funding allow, chasing new possibilities sparked by breakthroughs in technology. Modern forensic genealogy has solved dozens of cold cases once thought impossible, and some believe it as only a matter of time before the alphabet killer's identity comes to light. But for now the story is suspended and resolved incomplete, like a whisper caught between past and present. And perhaps that's what makes the alphabet murders so haunting. It's not just that 3 children were taken. It's not just that someone walked away unseen. It's that even after 50 years, the killer's shadow still stretches across time, invisible, silent, yet unmistakable. But Rochester wasn't alone in its fear. While the city tried to move forward, the 1970s brought another wave of violence and mystery elsewhere in America, a reminder that shadows weren't confined to one place. Across the country, in San Francisco, another predator stalked his victims, choosing them carefully, approaching them quietly, and vanishing into the night. He was called the Doodler. Between 1974 and 1975, this elusive figure moved through the city's thriving nightlife, sketching portraits of men in bars and clubs before luring them away and then killing them. At least 16 murders were linked to him, yet, just like Rochester's alphabet killer, he was never caught. Witnesses saw his face. Survivors spoke his name. And still, half a century later, his identity remains locked in silence. To cities, to predators, to trails gone cold, and as one mystery fades into another, we begin the next chapter in the streets of San Francisco, where the nightlife glittered, the music pulsed, and beneath the noise, danger waited quietly, pencil in hand. Let's begin. San Francisco in the mid-1970s was alive with energy. The city was a patchwork of neon lights, crowded bars, and music pouring out of open doors into streets that never seemed to sleep. It was a place where people came to find freedom, to reinvent themselves, to disappear into a community where no one asked too many questions. But beneath the glittering nightlife and the hum of jazz clubs, there were shadows, secrets whispered in alleyways, and danger hiding in the quiet spaces between one night and the next. It was here in this city of color and chaos that whispers began about a man known only as the Doodler. His nickname came from his unusual habit. He would sit in bars, clubs, and diners, sketching portraits of strangers on napkins or scraps of paper. He was young, polite, and soft-spoken, with an artistic charm that disarmed the people he approached. The sketches were his way in, a way to start conversations, to lower defenses, and eventually to lure men away from the crowded noise of the city into the shadows where no one could hear them. Between 1974 and 1975, at least 16 men were attacked, and as many as 14 were killed. The victims were primarily members of the LGBTQ community, men who had come to San Francisco in search of belonging, drawn to the vibrant freedom the city promised. At the time, the city's gay nightlife was thriving but also stigmatized. Reporting crimes to the police carried fear of exposure, judgment, or harassment. The Doodler understood this. He chose his hunting grounds carefully, knowing that silence would protect him as much as shadows did. The first known victim was discovered on a foggy January morning in 1974, near Ocean Beach, the stretch of coastline where the city met the endless gray of the Pacific. The man had been stabbed multiple times, his body partially hidden among the dunes. No identification, no witnesses, no clues. Detectives could only note that the area was quiet at night, perfect for someone who wanted to disappear without leaving a trace. 2 weeks later, another man was found near Golden Gate Park. The similarities were undeniable, the same precision, the same brutality. Investigators knew they were dealing with a serial predator, but they also understood something darker. He was careful, deliberate, and clever. Witnesses from nearby clubs spoke of a young man seen sketching portraits on cocktail napkins, approaching potential victims with a quiet confidence. He didn't stand out, didn't seem threatening. He was described as clean-cut, slender, and soft-spoken, someone who could easily blend into San Francisco's lively nightlife without drawing suspicion. And then there was his habit, leaving behind quick, beautiful sketches of the people he met. It gave him his name, the Doodler. Detectives worked tirelessly, but the investigation was complicated from the start. Many survivors of attacks were unwilling to speak to police for fear of being outed. In the 1970s, the LGBTQ+ community had little trust in law enforcement, and in many cases, justifiable reasons to avoid it. This silence protected the Doodler, allowing him to move freely between clubs, diners, and night streets, hunting without fear of exposure. Some of the men who survived later told their stories quietly, years after the fact. One described meeting the Doodler at a late-night diner, watching him draw a quick sketch before inviting him to talk somewhere quieter. When the man declined, the Doodler smiled politely, folded the sketch neatly, and walked away into the fog. Others weren't as fortunate. Those who accepted his invitation were often found hours later in parks, alleys, or along the city's rocky shoreline. The pattern became clearer with each victim. The attacks took place in or near known nightlife hubs, Castro District, Soma, and Polk Street, and the victims were often last seen alone, leaving clubs late at night. Forensic evidence was scarce, and witnesses struggled to provide consistent descriptions. The Doodler's quiet, unassuming demeanor allowed him to blend into the chaos of San Francisco nights, and his calculated patience made him nearly impossible to track. By the spring of 1975, fear had spread through the community. Flyers circulated in bars warning patrons to avoid leaving alone, to be cautious of strangers, and to report anything unusual. The Doodler's sketches became a source of both fascination and terror. Those who had seen him work described his portraits as hauntingly accurate, capturing faces in precise, elegant lines. It was as though he studied his subjects not just to draw them, but to know them, to understand their vulnerabilities before he struck. Police eventually identified several suspects, but lacked the evidence needed to make an arrest. Among those questioned was a young man who matched witness descriptions and had been seen frequenting several of the clubs connected to victims. He was brought in for interviews more than once, but without forensic proof or willing testimony from survivors, investigators were forced to let him go. The silence of the survivors weighed heavily on detectives. At least 3 men who had narrowly escaped attacks were known to police, but each declined to testify, fearing exposure, careers destroyed, and families who would not understand. The Doodler exploited this silence perfectly, moving deeper into the city's underground, adapting his methods as attention around the case grew. And then, just as suddenly as the killings began, they stopped. By the end of 1975, the bodies stopped appearing, and the Doodler vanished into the city's endless noise. The police never closed the case, and San Francisco never forgot. Over the years, advances in forensic science breathed new life into the investigation. Old evidence was retested, sketches were analyzed, and suspects were revisited. But the man behind the pencil, the man who lured victims with charm and talent, remains unidentified to this day. The mystery of the Doodler isn't just in his methods, it's in his disappearance. Did he leave San Francisco? Did he change his hunting grounds? Or did he simply stop, carrying his secrets into an ordinary life where no one would ever suspect him? Half a century later, the city still whispers his name. Among the archives of unsolved murders, his case stands out, a reminder of a predator who moved quietly, killed precisely, and faded away before anyone could catch him. And just like Rochester's alphabet killer, the Doodler left behind more questions than answers. To killers, to cities, to sets of unsolved crimes that drift like shadows through history, reminding us how little we sometimes see even when danger stands right beside us. By the summer of 1974, San Francisco police understood they were facing a predator unlike any they had dealt with before. At least 5 men were confirmed dead, each murdered brutally, and whispers inside the city's gay nightlife districts told of more attacks. Survivors who had escaped, shaken but unwilling to speak. The investigation into the Doodler was unlike any other, not just because of his strange methods, but because the very community he targeted was trapped between fear of him and fear of the police. The killings followed a terrifying rhythm. The bodies were discovered in isolated areas, Golden Gate Park, Ocean Beach, remote hiking trails, or desolate parking lots near the Pacific coastline. Each victim had been stabbed multiple times, the wounds precise, suggesting control rather than frenzy. Personal belongings were often missing, leading detectives to suspect trophies, but the motive seemed far deeper than theft. Detectives pieced together what little they could from the scattered crime scenes. Multiple bodies showed faint defensive wounds, evidence the victims had fought back. Fibers and footprints were collected, but in the 1970s, these were little more than guesses without modern databases to match them. A few strands of hair recovered near one of the bodies suggested a possible lead, but technology at the time could only confirm that the suspect was male. The sketching habit, the very trait that gave the killer his nickname, became central to the investigation. Survivors later revealed that he introduced himself casually, often sitting at bars or diners with his small sketchpad, quietly drawing portraits of patrons. He used his talent to disarm, to connect, to intrigue. His charm wasn't loud or overt, it was subtle, calculated, the kind that made people lean in rather than pull away. Detectives soon learned of 3 survivors who had encountered the Doodler but managed to escape. One man described meeting him at a well-known Castro bar late one night. They talked, laughed, and left together until, moments after arriving at a nearby apartment, the stranger turned violent. The survivor fought back and escaped into the hallway, bloodied and panicked, but when police asked him to file an official statement, he hesitated. He was a prominent figure in the entertainment industry, fearful that exposure would destroy his career. Another survivor, a respected diplomat, offered even fewer details, speaking only in vague references. He admitted meeting the Doodler, admitted narrowly escaping, but refused to testify publicly. The 3rd survivor worked in politics. His refusal was the most resolute of them all. In a time when being identified as gay could ruin reputations, destroy careers, and fracture families, silence became an unspoken pact. That silence became the Doodler's greatest weapon. Detectives knew they had living witnesses who could put him away, but without their cooperation, they lacked the foundation for an arrest. In an era when LGBTQ+ rights were still fighting for recognition, trust between the community and law enforcement was brittle, fractured by decades of discrimination. By late 1975, frustration within the investigation grew deeper. A key suspect had been identified, a young man who matched several witness descriptions and was seen in multiple bars where victims were last spotted. He was brought in for questioning repeatedly. He admitted to sketching people in public spaces, admitted to being in the same bars on the nights of the attacks, but denied any involvement in the murders. Without forensic evidence or direct testimony from survivors, detectives were forced to release him. And so, the Doodler vanished into the background, continuing to haunt the streets but leaving fewer traces behind. By the end of 1975, the killings seemed to stop, and no one knew why. Did he leave San Francisco? Did he change his methods? Or had he simply grown tired of the hunt? Years turned into decades, but the case was never officially closed. Investigators returned to it repeatedly, especially as new forensic techniques became available. DNA samples collected from the victims were tested in the 1990s, but the results were inconclusive. In the 2010s, the possibility of solving the case through genetic genealogy arose, a method that had cracked other decades-old mysteries. Old samples were retested using next-generation sequencing, and while partial profiles were extracted, contamination from years of handling limited their value. Despite this, hope remained. Detectives held press conferences, urging anyone with information, even anonymous tips, to come forward. New sketches of the suspect were released, combining the original witness descriptions with age progression techniques, showing what the Doodler might look like decades later. Leads trickled in, but none led to an arrest. For the LGBTQ+ community of San Francisco, the Doodler's story became more than just a cold case. It became a symbol of an era when silence, fear, and prejudice created the perfect storm for a killer to thrive unseen. The survivors' voices, unheard for so long, became central to the growing awareness of how mistrust between marginalized communities and law enforcement can leave wounds unhealed and killers uncaught. Even today, half a century later, the case is alive inside the San Francisco Police Department. A handful of detectives still monitor the evidence, reviewing every old report, every archived interview, hoping that advances in technology or courage from long-silent witnesses will finally close the file. The Doodler remains a ghost, a man who walked through crowded bars and quiet parks, sketched faces in perfect lines, and disappeared into history without leaving his own behind. By the mid-1970s, the investigation into the Doodler had grown colder, yet more complex. The bodies had stopped appearing, but the fear remained, stitched deeply into San Francisco's nightlife. Detectives turned their attention inward, shifting from chasing leads to understanding why this man killed, how he chose his victims, and what patterns hid beneath the chaos. This was when the work of criminal profiling began to take center stage, the slow, patient unraveling of a mind that had left so many shadows behind. The surviving victims provided the first pieces of the psychological puzzle. While they had refused to testify publicly, fragments of their quiet statements, preserved in police notes, described the same chilling familiarity. A man who seemed gentle, polite, almost shy. He didn't approach his victims aggressively. He disarmed them with his calm demeanor, his soft voice, and his sketchbook. Some said he offered compliments. Others described how he made them laugh. He built a sense of connection within minutes, lowering defenses before the violence came. Behavioral experts from the FBI's emerging profiling unit reviewed the details in 1976 and came to unsettling conclusions. They believed the Doodler was likely a young man in his early to mid-20s at the time, someone intelligent and deliberate but deeply conflicted. His method suggested a dual nature, control combined with artistry, patience paired with calculated violence. The sketches weren't just an introduction. They were a ritual, a symbolic act tied to identity and possession. Investigators theorized that by drawing his victims first, he turned them into objects of fixation. And when he killed them, it completed something inside him, a compulsion rooted in obsession. But his choice of victims spoke volumes, too. He targeted gay men during a time when being openly gay carried profound risks. San Francisco's Castro district was thriving with new freedoms, but prejudice remained widespread both socially and within law enforcement. The Doodler knew this. He understood the reluctance of victims to come forward, exploited the tension between identity and secrecy, and used silence as his shield. Detectives would later describe him as a killer perfectly adapted to his environment. The FBI noted another critical element: control. The Doodler's attacks were swift but clean, his stabbings precise rather than frenzied, suggesting confidence and preparation rather than impulsive rage. This likely meant he rehearsed scenarios mentally, choosing locations carefully, and selecting areas where discovery would be delayed. His preferred spots: isolated beaches, dimly lit park trails, the edges of Golden Gate Park, offered just enough cover without feeling unsafe to those he lured there. Yet, his disappearance after 1975 complicated everything. Serial offenders rarely stop voluntarily, and when they do, there are typically only a few explanations. Investigators debated three main possibilities: relocation. Perhaps he left San Francisco altogether, moving to another city where murders similar to his went unnoticed, disconnected from the Doodler's name and pattern. Incarceration. Some believe he may have been arrested for unrelated crimes, spending years in prison while the Doodler case went cold. Evolution. The darkest theories suggested he changed his methods entirely, abandoning his sketches, his choice of victims, or even his weapon, becoming invisible in his reinvention. Forensic science of the time offered little clarity. Fibers recovered from clothing showed traces of synthetic materials common to thousands of garments. Soil samples from shoes revealed nothing unique. The knife used, believed to be medium-sized with a smooth blade, left no distinctive marks. The Doodler knew how to leave nothing behind, a predator walking through crowded spaces without a single trace of himself. Years later, when technology advanced, investigators revisited the evidence with fresh eyes and new tools. Early DNA testing failed, as contamination and degradation had ruined many samples collected in the 1970s. But they didn't give up. In the 2000s, as techniques improved, fragments of usable profiles began to emerge, stored carefully in hopes that modern genealogical analysis could finally uncover his identity. The connection between old cases and new science felt tantalizingly close, yet still just beyond reach. The victims' families endured decades of silence, many living with unanswered questions. The few survivors who encountered the Doodler lived quietly, carrying the burden of knowing his face, but never seeing justice. Police always believed those testimonies held the key, but the social cost of speaking out in that era was devastatingly high. One survivor later confided to an investigator in private, "I knew his eyes. I'll never forget them. But if I said his name then, I would have lost everything." Modern profiling goes even deeper than investigators in the 1970s could have imagined. Specialists today believe the Doodler likely harbored intense internal conflict about his identity, particularly his sexuality. Living at a time when societal pressures left little space for acceptance. Some theorize his attacks were expressions of self-hatred, a violent rejection of desires he couldn't reconcile. Others point to the artistic ritual of sketching as a sign of someone seeking control over relationships and intimacy, a man who first captured beauty on paper before destroying it in reality. The FBI's profile suggests he wasn't impulsive but patient, capable of holding conversations, studying behaviors, and waiting until his victims trusted him enough to leave public spaces. He likely lived alone or maintained a carefully hidden double life. Witness descriptions from survivors often place him as neat, tidy, and controlled, with an almost obsessive attention to detail, traits that mirrored the meticulous way he stalked and selected his victims. As the decades passed, San Francisco changed. The Castro became a symbol of resilience, a place rebuilt from fear into pride. Yet the Doodler's case still hangs over the city like a shadow. Each time investigators release new composite sketches, each time news reports revisit the story, the same question rises quietly from the past. Who was he? Detectives today believe the answer still exists, hidden in plain sight. The advances in forensic genealogy that solved the Golden State Killer case in 2018 may someday do the same here. They hope that a tiny fragment of DNA preserved from a victim's clothing will eventually unlock a chain of distant relatives, leading back to one man. A man who once walked into bars with a sketchbook and a quiet smile, left behind lines on paper, and vanished into history. But until that day comes, the Doodler remains a phantom, defined only by patterns, shadows, and unanswered questions. In the next segment, we'll explore the aftermath, how the case reshaped San Francisco, how the LGBTQ community carried its scars, and how the Doodler became one of the city's longest-standing ghosts. By the end of 1975, the attacks attributed to the Doodler appeared to have stopped, but San Francisco wasn't at peace. The killings had left a quiet scar across the city, reshaping its nightlife, its neighborhoods, and the fragile relationship between the LGBTQ+ community and law enforcement. Even without new bodies being discovered, fear still lingered in the bars and clubs where the Doodler once hunted, and suspicion became part of everyday life. At the time, the Castro district was becoming one of the most vibrant centers of LGBTQ culture in the country. San Francisco had become a refuge for thousands seeking freedom and self-expression, a city where the underground became visible and where identity could finally breathe. But alongside the promise of safety came the reality of stigma, and this tension defined the investigation as much as the killings themselves. Police knew they were at a disadvantage. Members of the LGBTQ+ community already facing discrimination, workplace prejudice, and strained family ties, feared exposure more than justice. Being outed in the 1970s could cost someone their job, their reputation, even their home. Survivors, who had narrowly escaped the Doodler's attacks, quietly told detectives pieces of the story, but refused to testify. Some were prominent figures, men whose names would have made headlines. Others had private lives carefully hidden from their families or employers. For them, silence wasn't just self-protection, it was survival. Within the police department, frustration mounted. Detectives had suspects. They had survivors who had seen the killer's face, some even knowing his name. But the absence of testimony made any arrest impossible. Prosecutors warned that without living witnesses willing to testify under oath, the case would crumble in court. This stalemate shaped everything that came after. The Doodler learned to move within this silence, exploiting the fears of those he targeted. Even as warnings circulated through bars and clubs, urging patrons to leave together, to trust no strangers, the city's distrust of law enforcement left gaps wide enough for a predator to slip through. The community carried the weight of these choices quietly. Behind the neon signs and crowded dance floors, conversations about safety grew sharper. Men avoided leaving clubs alone, looking for familiar faces before stepping into the night. Flyers reminded everyone to report suspicious encounters, but few did. Fear worked both ways: fear of being attacked, and fear of becoming a name on a police report that the world might read. Meanwhile, detectives built one of the largest case files the San Francisco Police Department had ever assembled. Inside it were sketches of suspects, interview transcripts, photographs of secluded crime scenes, and witness statements sealed under promises of anonymity. The threads were all there, hundreds of hours of work, countless fragments of evidence, but none of it tied together tightly enough to catch a killer who had walked away unseen. Years passed, and San Francisco changed. By the 1980s, the city faced the devastation of the AIDS crisis, shifting focus away from past violence to the immediate emergency unfolding in hospitals and neighborhoods. Entire communities were reshaped, and many who had once whispered about the Doodler were gone, their voices lost forever. The murders became part of the city's haunted memory, spoken of less and less, but never truly forgotten. Then came the rise of DNA forensics. By the 1990s, technology promised new hope for cold cases once thought unsolvable. Evidence collected from the Doodler's victims, clothing fibers, hairs, and biological traces, was carefully retested. But contamination from decades of storage and the limitations of 1970s evidence handling created another dead end. Investigators extracted fragments of profiles, but not enough for a definitive match. In the 2010s, advances in genetic genealogy brought fresh momentum. Detectives partnered with private labs specializing in degraded samples, hoping to find even the smallest genetic connections. They began comparing evidence against public DNA databases, where distant relatives could create the roadmap to an identity. Yet again, results remained incomplete, leaving the Doodler's name hidden in the folds of time. Today, the case lives on quietly inside the San Francisco Police Department. A handful of detectives review it periodically, hoping that one day technology will catch up to the fragments left behind. But more than 5 decades later, the story of the Doodler is as much about what happened as it is about what didn't he. Testimonies never given, evidence never secured, and the killer who vanished into the noise of a city too divided to stop him. For the families of those lost, closure has never come. They remember their loved ones in vigils and quiet conversations, but the absence of answers weighs heavily. For many, justice feels out of reach, yet hope survives in the steady march of science. Every year, investigators revisit the case with newer tools, convinced that one overlooked clue, one forgotten detail, might finally unlock the truth. And beneath the surface of San Francisco streets, under the rebuilt neighborhoods and evolving communities, the memory of the Doodler still lingers. His face, his sketches, his quiet voice inviting strangers into the night. These fragments remain suspended in time, waiting for the day when his name will finally be spoken aloud. But even if his identity is discovered, the Doodler will always belong to an era where fear thrived in silence, where stigma kept secrets buried, and where trust was too fragile to bridge the gap between victims and justice. By the summer of 1975, San Francisco had fallen silent. The killings had stopped, but the fear still lingered in the air like a faint fog rolling in from the bay. People whispered in bars and cafes about the man they called the Doodler, a quiet figure with a sketchbook, a soft smile, and hands that could create beauty on paper before taking life in the shadows. The city had grown used to the rhythm of its nights, music spilling from crowded bars, glasses clinking, laughter echoing into narrow streets. But those who remembered the headlines, the warnings, the faces of men who never came home, they walked differently now. They glanced over their shoulders. They left bars in groups, not alone. Detectives still worked the case, flipping through sketches and photographs late into the night. They had suspects. They had survivors. They had the faint outlines of his face drawn from memory. And yet, somehow, the man slipped through their fingers like smoke. One suspect stood out more than the others, a young man who moved comfortably through the city's nightlife, quiet and polite, blending into every room. Several survivors recognized him, their voices low, their statements sealed in confidence. But they couldn't testify. In that time, speaking openly meant risking everything, their jobs, their families, their carefully built lives. Silence wasn't a choice, it was survival. The police understood, even as frustration grew. Without their voices, there was no case. Without testimony, there could be no trial. And so the Doodler walked away, not because he was invisible, but because the city itself could not speak his name. And then, as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. The attack stopped. No more bodies were found in the quiet dunes of Ocean Beach. No more sketches were left behind on diner napkins. No one saw his soft smile again in the Castro's crowded bars. Some detectives believe he left San Francisco, carrying his darkness to another city where his name meant nothing. Others whispered he had been arrested on unrelated charges, sitting in a cell while investigators searched in vain. A few feared the most chilling possibility of all, that he never stopped, that he only changed, abandoning the sketches, the patterns, and the name that once defined him. Years turned into decades. San Francisco changed, rebuilt, and grew louder, prouder, brighter. But the Doodler remained, not in flesh and blood, but in memory. The quiet sketch artist who slipped into bars with his notebook, who blended into laughter and music, who walked through crowded rooms and seen his shadow stretched across time. Families still waited for answers, keeping photographs in drawers and memories close to their hearts. Survivors carried unspoken truths, some taking them silently through the years, others finally sharing fragments of their encounters long after the world had stopped asking. Then came the promise of new hope. In the 1990s, technology brought the possibility of DNA testing. Old evidence was reopened, fibers and fragments carefully retested under the glow of modern machines. But decades of storage had taken their toll, and the answers remained locked away in degraded samples and faded records. The 2010s brought another wave of possibility. Genealogical DNA, the same science that would solve the Golden State Killer case, gave no life to old mysteries. Investigators pulled the Doodler's case from its boxes once again, sending samples to private labs, chasing threads across family trees. They waited, quietly, for a name. It hasn't come yet. But somewhere, hidden in those fragments, is the truth. Today, San Francisco has moved forward, but on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the streets and the lights of the Castro glow against the fog, the Doodler's name still stirs in whispers. People remember the sketches, the soft voice, the way he watched from the corners of crowded rooms. They remember the warning signs and fear, and the silence that let him disappear. Some believe he's gone, buried beneath the weight of time. Others believe he's still out there, living under another name, another life, far from the city where he once hunted. And perhaps, somewhere, there's someone who knows, someone who saw his face, who held one of those sketches, who remembers the quiet man with the pencil and the smile. Until that day comes, the Doodler's story remains unfinished, drifting like fog above Ocean Beach, lingering in the bars he once haunted, etched into napkins and memory alike. And yet, San Francisco isn't the only city where shadows like his once walked. While the Doodler disappeared into history, another predator was moving quietly miles away from here, leaving behind his own trail of fear, one defined not by sketches, but by silence, by secrets, and by faces that remain nameless even now. San Francisco has changed so much since those nights in the mid-1970s, when music spilled into the streets of the Castro and Polk Gulch, when laughter drifted beneath neon lights, and when, somewhere in the crowd, a man with a quiet smile and a sketchbook watched, waited, and chose. But even as the years passed, and the bars were rebuilt, and the city grew louder and brighter, the story of the Doodler remained tucked into its shadows, refusing to be forgotten. After the summer of 1975, there were no more bodies found on the dunes of Ocean Beach, no more lifeless men hidden among the tall grass of Golden Gate Park, no more sketches left unfinished on napkins or tucked into back pockets. It was as if he disappeared, walked out of the city one foggy night and vanished into the endless noise of time. But his silence left a weight behind. Detectives held on for years, revisiting old case files, hoping that one overlooked note, one discarded detail might reveal the truth. The binders grew worn, the photographs faded around the edges, but the faces of his victims never stopped looking back. Each had their own life, their own story, their own reasons for being out that night, and each one ended in the same way, quiet, violent, and unanswered. For the survivors, the men who had seen him up close, who had felt his presence before escaping into the safety of the night, time brought little relief. Some still lives far away from San Francisco, carving out existences untouched by the whispers of the case. Others remained close, quietly carrying the burden of a memory they could never speak aloud. They knew his face, his voice, his hands, the calm way he would them close. And yet they chose silence, bound by the realities of an era when being truthful would have destroyed them in other ways. One detective, years later, would admit that this silence haunted him most of all. "We had him," he said softly in an interview. "We had his name, his face, his habits. And we couldn't touch him. It was all right there, just out of reach." In the decades that followed, science caught up with the ghosts of the past. Technology advanced, machines became smarter, and investigators reached into storage boxes where fragile fibers and preserved samples waited patiently for their turn. Each time they tried again, the 1990s, the early 2000s, the late 2010s, they carried hope into the lab with them, believing this time would be different. But each time, the answers dissolved into fragments. The samples were too degraded, the evidence too fragile, the traces too faint to name a killer. And yet the Doodler's shadow never left San Francisco entirely. It lingers in the spaces he once walked, beneath the hum of fluorescent diner lights, on the stools where he once sat sketching strangers into likenesses so vivid they almost breathe. It lingers in the quiet parts of the city, where the sound of waves against the shoreline mixes with the rustling of wind through tall grass and memories buried deep in sand. For those who lived through it, the fear became a rhythm, one that never fully faded, even as the city grew stronger, prouder, louder. They still remember the warnings whispered late at night. Don't leave alone, don't trust strangers, don't follow anyone into the fog. The bars changed names, the streets changed faces, but the memory of those nights, of soft voices, folded sketches, and unseen danger, remained untouched by time. Some believe he died long ago, taking his secrets with him to a grave without a name. Others think he's still out there, his life unremarkable, hidden beneath decades of ordinary days, a job, a family, a quiet existence far from the city where his sketches once drew people close. And then there are those who cannot let go of the idea that he didn't stop at all, that he only learned to hide better, his patterns disappearing into cities where no one thought to look. Today, the Doodler's case sits open but quiet, filed among the stacks of unsolved mysteries inside the San Francisco Police Department. New detectives inherit the story the way one passes down a ghost, gently, reverently, hoping one day someone will finish what so many began. Each fresh set of eyes lingers on the sketches, the statements, the faded crime scene photographs, trying to see something others missed. And maybe one day they will. Because somewhere, within the silence, the answer exists. It could be hidden in an overlooked report, tucked away in the memory of someone who has carried a face for half a century, or waiting in a fragment of DNA so small it's almost invisible. Technology keeps evolving. The world keeps changing. And justice, even when slow, can be patient enough to wait. But for now, the Doodler remains a name without a man, a shadow without a face. His story is written not in conclusions but in questions, questions about trust, about silence, about the fragile line between beauty and danger, intimacy and violence, freedom and fear. And perhaps that's why the Doodler still haunts us, all these years later. It isn't just the mystery of who he was. It's the silence he left behind, the stories untold, the faces unseen, the sketches unfinished. Late at night, when the city grows quiet and the fog rolls in from the bay, you can almost imagine him sitting there still, in a corner booth of some dimly lit diner, sketchpad open, pencil moving in smooth, quiet strokes. A man who captured strangers in lines and shadows, leaving behind something beautiful before stepping into something dark. And maybe one day, when the last missing detail finally falls into place, the silence will break. Until then, The Doodler lives on in the spaces between what we know and what we can never quite name. Reminder that sometimes the most haunting mysteries are the ones that remain unsolved.